Okay, I think we're going to get started here in Geneva in the afternoon. Welcome, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us. My name is Helen McElhinney. I'm the Executive Director of the CDAC Network, which stands for Communicating with Disaster Affected Communities. And we're very pleased to have you join us this afternoon to talk about this issue, which is very, very much at the heart of the CDAC mission about shifting power and agency to people affected by crises. Now, we've got a great panel, and we're going to let them all introduce themselves in a second. But before they do, I would love to invite you to engage a little bit with us and let us know your feelings. You don't have to put a name to it, but we thought we might ask what you're thinking about the use of AI in humanitarian action. I think it's a one-word answer. So I'm going to push you to be really precise on exactly how you feel about this, which is very in keeping with how. Why not? Why not? There we go. So yes, feel free to engage, and we'll come back to the outcomes of this in a second. Now, before I go on to introductions, I just wanted to give a bit of a scene setter because, as with many of the panels at HNPW this year, we actually conceived of this panel before the current crisis that we are in. When I was reflecting on what we would need to do to adapt and update this session, it was quite interesting to realize that we didn't have to update that much, right? Because what we were already thinking about when we were looking at these kinds of how do we make responsible the AI use in humanitarian action a reality? It was really trying to address what was already going on with a shift in power. Who has power and where will power come from and be situated in the humanitarianism of the future? And how do we ensure that we engineer in a space for the voice of communities and a space for accountability in that humanitarian future? And so that's a bit of what we will be looking at today in this new crisis moment, which only makes things that much more important to engage with. So we are very pleased to be able to offer 3 very practical examples of projects that are getting up and off the ground, thinking through some of these challenges right now. And they were all aiming to help humanitarians navigate these difficult choices that are coming at us fast at the moment in relation to tech take-up. I would like to start by introducing our first guest who is online, Giulio Coppi from Access Now. Very warm welcome and thank you for joining us. Giulio, you've led some research in this field around AI and technology, and you're about to embark on a new project of note for us all to be aware of. So I wonder if I could ask you to introduce yourself and explain some of the findings from your work last year and how you're building on that work now.
Thank you. And yes, indeed. I work as senior humanitarian officer at Access Now. Access Now, for those who don't know, it's an organization working at the intersection of digital rights and human rights. And now, with the work that I'm doing on the intersection also of the humanitarian framework, what it does is that it protects and expands digital rights for everyone, everywhere. The work that we have been doing, it has been kind of a stepping stone into the humanitarian digital sphere for us as an organization. And we, in 2024, we published this quite substantial report on the role of private technology and how it is mixed with the work of humanitarian actors at all levels, starting from data collection at the field level up to the cloud and AI and advanced analytics tools. And when it comes to AI, some of our findings were about the almost monopoly of, for example, Azure when it comes to cloud computing on the humanitarian sphere, with a few exceptions here and there. The new trends highlighting the role of, for example, the UN Computing Center trying to set up new cloud spaces for UN-only data, and what does that mean for the ecosystem as a whole. The fact that very often we talk a lot about the role of companies, but actually algorithmic models come from research funded and led by public universities or by researchers. So this is something, an aspect that is usually neglected, but it's something that we flag that we should pay more attention to. And finally, the fact of the role of humanitarian actors as rare data sets purveyor, like those kind of actors that have access to untapped data sources that are vital for the business model of AI companies. And the results of this early research basically led to the fact that we realized that companies were not open to discuss the terms of the agreement with the humanitarian actors. They were not open to discuss where do they work, in which crisis, and what are the challenges to work with the humanitarian field. And humanitarians were not either available or not completely free to discuss the terms of their agreement with these companies, exactly because of non-disclosure agreements or terms of contracts or any kind of situation, contractual or logistical procurement-related situation that made it basically impossible to do any kind of sharing of lessons learned and challenges in the sector. So this year, thanks to the support of the German Federal Foreign Office, we started kind of a spin-off, a little bit more laser focus on this specific aspect. Say everybody's talking about the risks and challenges and potential of AI. We don't want to look at that. We want to look at how are we building those systems? How are companies shipping or packing that system for the humanitarian sector? How is the humanitarian sector negotiating those terms? What does that mean in terms of using advanced analytics for the nonprofit, the humanitarian sector as a whole, and what kind of lessons learned can be extracted from that so that we as a sector can all benefit, and not just the big actor, but also the small charities, the small NGOs, to democratize a little bit the access to this knowledge and this capacity, and to have more transparency in the way that we will shape AI technology for the future. Back to you.
Great, thanks very much. And it feels like it's absolutely vital and needed to understand that interface between tech companies and their incentives and humanitarian agencies and their incentives. I wonder if I could push you, Giulio, on what outputs we expect and when.
We hope by the end of this year to be able to publish a sort of a set of guidance, like a set of guidelines, and I wouldn't call it a toolkit because now everything is a toolkit, so it doesn't mean much anymore. But kind of a set of guidance that can guide especially small and medium-sized organizations in dealing with emerging technologies. It's not just AI, but also anything that has to do with predictive analytics or anything related to cloud computing that requires a lot of processing power, that has heavy implications on the budget, but also potential implications on the ethics and the responsible data use for their ethical framework.
Amazing. Thank you very much. I know just from having spoken to some of the people in the audience that there's people particularly interested in this procurement angle here today. So I'm sure people will be very, very keen to see how that progresses. I'm going to move us on actually to our next panelist, Alex from Nesta, the Centre for Collective Intelligence Design and Nesta. Very warm welcome. Thank you for coming over from London for the panel. And it's brilliant to have you here today. I know Nesta have been exploring opportunities in this space, and we've been fortunate enough to work together a bit on some of that. And one of the more interesting ones is the AI safety label specifically. And I was hoping you'd be able to talk us through this initiative. Alex.
Yeah, of course. So I'm the research lead at the Centre for Collective Intelligence at Nesta. And Nesta, for anyone who hasn't come across us previously, is the UK's innovation foundation. At the Centre, we really specialise in designing technology and helping organisations to work more effectively with the public or the communities that they serve. And we've been working with humanitarian partners since 2021, supported by the UK Humanitarian Innovation Hub. And the work that Helen referred to is the kind of latest iteration of that project. I guess at the heart of everything we've been doing is really this idea of participatory design, development, and oversight of AI humanitarian tools. And so I think one of the key challenges or problems that we're trying to solve is how do we kind of grapple with all of the opportunity and excitement around AI technology, whilst at the same time addressing a known kind of gap in awareness and ability to manage risks effectively, and also meeting accountability commitments to communities. certainly the AI safety label does not solve all of those problems, but we hope that what we've kind of demonstrated through exploring it as a concept over the last 9 months is that it could be a vital piece of the puzzle where you're actually bringing in communities into an AI assurance process and getting their input on what level of risk they find acceptable, what kind of safeguards they think are most necessary in order to feel comfortable with the use of a particular tool in a particular context. So we have kind of designed a process for bringing communities into discussions around those concepts of risks and acceptability and safeguards. And the end product of that is something that we're calling an AI safety label, although I'm not sure it's necessarily the most helpful term. I would like to maybe shift that towards an advisory label, something that's very practical, actionable for humanitarians who are trying to make these decisions about either procurement or use of a tool to support their operations. And I guess the key audiences that we see for this type of output are the technology developers and humanitarians who are then using these tools. Because when it comes to risks, it's really at the kind of tool side or at the use side where we see a lot of those risks kind of manifesting. And also it's those parties that are the ones who can implement safeguards to try and manage some of those risks. Of course, nothing is entirely risk-free or safe when it comes to this technology, but at least having that community input as well as the kind of existing due diligence processes that some organizations have is another vital piece of information that they should be considering when making those decisions. And I guess during the project, which we worked on with CDAC and Sphere and Data Friendly Space as well, we were mostly kind of trying to understand 3 key questions. First, is this needed? Is it feasible to do? And is it viable in the long term? And we ran a lot of stakeholder interviews, design workshops, and importantly, we also tested the community assessment piece, working with local residents in Antakya, who had been impacted by the earthquakes in 2023, and asking them what they thought about a tool that had been developed by the Red Cross to assess building damage. And I guess some just key takeaways. I know sorry, I've probably already overspoken my 5 minutes, but we can get into the details more later. But what we've heard from the humanitarians that we've spoken to is that something that is as practical as a kind of advisory label is necessary. So they really saw the value in it, particularly the community assessment piece. So while there is a lot of information around high-level principles and also a more kind of technical aspects of assurance, this really felt to a lot of people we spoke to like something that wasn't being discussed. How do we practically involve communities in helping us make these decisions? We also found that it is possible to do, and our experience in Antakya hopefully was something that can be, I guess, an example, a case study that inspires others, and that actually you can get meaningful information that is also something that people are, I guess, motivated to contribute to. And we got a lot of feedback from those workshops from the residents who were involved that they really valued the opportunity to be involved in those discussions. And I guess on the other hand, what we found is that maybe when it comes to AI assurance, the sector isn't quite ready. And that's not unique to the humanitarian sector, I should say. There are many other domains that are grappling with how to make decisions about when to use AI, if to use AI, how to use AI. When you look at the kind of technologies or processes available for AI assurance, it's really quite an immature market at the moment. But we found there was a lack of incentives around adopting AI assurance processes, and that's something I think that does need to be addressed. And there's a lot to be said for just kind of socializing even these ideas, building the kind of buy-in awareness, and probably piloting some of these processes to kind of demonstrate their potential and their effectiveness. We are currently trying a similar approach, working in the UK public sector, which I can also maybe bring in as an example later. But yeah, I think it, as I said, it's maybe one piece of the puzzle. There's also a lot to be said for training and raising awareness around AI risks, understanding about the potential of AI, but also how to manage risks effectively. And actually, together with CDAC, as part of a larger program of work, we developed a kind of short training course available on the Humanitarian Leadership Academy platform, Kaya, which provides kind of basic introduction to collective intelligence and AI. And there are other schemes that are ongoing. I know a lot of people are kind of working and interested in this space, and hopefully Safe AI, which we'll hear about now as well, is a good way of kind of like bringing all this together. So I definitely overspoke.
Beautiful segue, thank you. No, and also I think someone in my team will kindly drop the link to the training course for people into the chat. We can send that out to people registered afterwards. Thank you, Alex. That's brilliant. And yes, as you said, the last but not least project that I want to introduce us to is called Safe AI. But I want to start by asking now, what does this acronym mean? Sarah Spencer, putting you on the spot. Can you remember what? Just
I will leave it for you all to hazard a guess. So the Safe AI project is funded by the UK government, and I think what strikes me as interesting, having worked in the AI and humanitarian action space for a better part of 5 years, when I first started engaging in this space in 2019 and 2020, most humanitarian actors, friends, like colleagues, long colleagues, really didn't have enough time or energy to engage in any of these questions. We're not interested. And what's interesting is to come to HNPW today, and it feels like AI is literally everywhere. It feels like an AI conference rather than a humanitarian one. So this project funded by the UK government was, again, the call was put out before the current crisis in which we are in, from the humanitarian sector, and as an attempt to really try and bring together multiple strands of work related to the safe and responsible use of AI. And understanding how the UK government can help to support the development of a framework to enable the safe and ethical adoption of AI in the humanitarian sector. Now, I think it's safe to say that in the current context, we really do risk a sort of accelerating a race to the bottom and trying to find additional ways to adopt AI in a way that maybe is less safe or less responsible, in the hope that it is the holy grail. It's like the Hail Mary, the last straw that will save some of our programs because it will deliver this untold efficiency or realize some efficiency costs that are so desperately needed now. And there's lots of policy papers and frameworks and principles, as Julio has mentioned and as Alex has mentioned, toolkits. And the aim of this project is not to duplicate or efforts or replicate the wheel, but to think about how we apply those in a sensible way. How do we bring those tools to humanitarians where they are in a more practical way? I think, as someone who now feels like I've spent many years in engaging in this sector and delivering services as well, there's a lot of principles and guidelines and things generally for humanitarian action. And I think the idea here for us to seize upon the opportunities, the real opportunities that exist with AI, whilst mitigating the risks, means that we have to be really clear on what those guidelines and standards look like. So in my mind, this project is really about applied ethics, applied responsibility, applying these tools. And maybe we can conceive of it as like the mortar between the bricks, right? Everyone's got their own institutional policies and frameworks around AI, but this is about how do we bring those together and find the best ways to deliver that. Alex was talking about participation and, building on Nessa's work and others who have, and really, frankly, the humanitarian sector's work on community participation over the last several decades, we are falling short on what we should be doing as humanitarians to engage with communities and to get their views on AI and safe and responsible use of AI, not least because those are conversations that are happening right now in Europe and North America, but for some reason we're accelerating uptake of AI in high risk, high stakes contexts without really engaging meaningfully with communities who are affected by those decisions and outputs. And as Alex said, not only do communities want to engage, but they know how to engage. CDAC has led very similar work in northern Kenya in the camps, and most of the communities there are using AI tools, are using chatbots for things, and are aware of some of the risks. But with participation, so one component of our work is around participation and really trying to identify ways to support meaningful engagement and participation and avoiding tokenistic participation. It's really easy to frame, depending on who the actor is and depending on how you frame some of these conversations, to get outcomes that the outcomes you're looking for, right? If I structure the conversation or the discussions in a certain way, I could get an outcome that will be beneficial to me, but may not be reflective of what the community wants. So trying to avoid, have strategies to avoid tokenistic participation. The second is really around standards and regulation. And this sometimes, like procurement, makes people fall asleep, but it's the most critical. And if we've ever worked together, this won't be the last time nor the first that you've heard me bang on about ISO and IEC standards that exist that are non-technical standards related to risk management for AI. And there's still plenty of people who are unaware that these standards exist. So I think, yes, we need to look towards humanitarian specific standards, but also there's a lot of work that's been done outside the humanitarian sector. And this is about bringing in those resources. So 42001, what does certification in that risk, in that standard look like for humanitarian agencies? The NIST in the United States has a risk management standard as well. And the State Department, the US State Department last year looked at applying that for specific issues related to human rights. So there's work out there. And I think for us, it's about trying to seize on that and build on that. And then on Alex's point on assurance, again, there's loads of work happening on technical and technological assurance of models. And the examples I always say is you don't buy a car and then drive that car for 20 years expecting it to perform perfectly from the day that you bought it without doing any kind of servicing. That's an absurd belief. And yet somehow that's the way that we're approaching AI, is that you're not going to test drive it. You're not going to get any manufacturer like warranty to certify that it performs as it says it does, and then you're never going to test it throughout the whole range of its use. Or getting into a lift and not seeing the service paper on the side to say, right, Sarah has come and serviced this elevator on this day. It's the same thing. And to Julio's point, being transparent about that, being transparent about those model evals and the regular stress testing and red teaming and seeing where it goes wrong is really critical. And in the AI research community, I know Anjali will speak to this and Michael, but in the research community for AI researchers, they are really open with publishing some of where the faults are and the flaws are. And I think we need to sort of follow suit. I think the last thing I will say, and then I'll be quiet, is that, this stuff costs money, right? The idea that AI is free is false. That is a false belief that this is somehow gonna be the free tool that helps us deliver services to all. And in an earlier conversation today, a colleague said, if that were the case, why didn't that happen 2 or 3 years ago, right? And there are real reasons. It's because those partnerships have costs, whether those are costs, tangible financial costs, or costs to our humanitarian principles like impartiality or neutrality, or actually just the cost of meaningful participation and the cost of meaningful engagement and technological stress testing. None of this stuff is free. So I think, we need to hopefully collectively move together to really pick apart this promise of efficiency and really get down to the details to say who wins, who loses, where. How does this shift the debate, and how do we make sure we stay grounded in our commitments to accountability and community participation?
Thanks. And just so that I didn't put you on the spot, we did put up in the chat what safe AI means, but for those in the room, you can still guess. We can come back to it. So as you can see, the Safe AI project team is made up of the panelists, and Sarah and Anjali, I'm going to pass over to next, who's also on the Safe AI project team, could potentially dig into this governance, the governance point. What does good look like? Is it boxes to tick? How should humanitarians be thinking about AI governance?
Thank you, Helen. I think picking up on Sarah's points, there are standards out there. There are AI principles out there. And we've seen that there's also just a very complex interplay that's happening between different states and their decisions on what to do about regulation, where they see that as regulation as stifling innovation versus those that are doubling down on regulation, as well as this interplay with geopolitics, trade policy side of things, as well as corporate policy and practice, which we're all seeing shifting, right? So the standards that are out there, again, they are sometimes general and they need to be made more specific to what that means within the humanitarian sector. And so as Sarah said, it's about thinking about what the humanitarian sector's principles and values are, and what that means. It's also recognizing, you know, we say the word AI, but that's just a broad term for potentially lots of different things. As Julio said, you know, there's a predictive analytics, et cetera. All of these things, whatever term we're using, we also need to be clear about that. And they will have different implications in terms of what should be in place, their impact. And also, you know, you can take a particular, if you want to say, AI tool, and then what does that mean in a particular context? So, you know, out there in general, we've had, there's been lots of controversy around facial recognition technology. And years ago, you know, some of it was recognizing around issues that there was a differentiation, issues in terms of like dark women and how they were being recognized or not being recognized in the same way. And but even if you got, say, a training data that was balanced, et cetera, it's then the use of that technology in a particular context, right? You take facial recognition technology and you put it in schools versus you put it outside in the public spaces. What are you using it for? And then, of course, if you transplant that into different states, different communities, different countries, recognizing their legislation, but also what it means to them and what the potential consequences are for different communities, and that it's a differential impact. So I think it's recognizing that these are all nuanced. And so that's some of the critical questions that need to be asked when you're procuring an AI system or when you're developing it in-house or building upon these systems is, what are those risks? What does that mean in a particular context? When is there going to be sort of a potential lower risk or harm and not? And to say again, I think there's one thing from my perspective is that it's not just either like legal or technical. It is socio-technical. It is sort of cultural and contextual, and it's really about recognizing what can we do in terms of bringing regulation, governance, in line with also technical realities as they are evolving and changing in like a dynamic normative environment that we are in, with changes in capability for AI. It's also where, you know, the technical aspects of what we might be putting in place as well to respect responsible AI, various principles, is how we can better align those to some of the technical and other governance or mechanisms to be put in place. So it's really about bringing them together in those contexts, which makes it quite complex and not as simple as a set of just like, here you go, this is it.
One quick point, if that's okay, just to build on what Anjali is saying, is that I think in my experience, what I've seen humanitarian agencies, the sort of conceptual mindset that we have is like, it's either ethical or not ethical. And this is like, reject that false binary, right? These are the principles that we have inherently within humanitarian work, as well as within these use cases, are at odds with each other. And every individual and agency will have to make decisions about which ones are more important or less important, and then mitigate the risks from that. So there is no clear way of like, yes, that's a good case, that's a bad case. And I think there is that approach that people are taking to it. And then the other thing to flag for those who weren't necessarily tracking, in February, the first week of February, right before the Action Summit, Google, the same week, I think, Google not only removed its DEI policies, but it also removed its responsible AI policies. So it got rid of both in one week. Yeah. There's others who have followed suit. So I think that, I mean, that we know we're going to get to partnerships, but I think they're really like this, all of this adds up to like, is this an ethical solution? How are we procuring our models? Whose data is it in the first place? If you got that data from delivering programs, did you get consent from those people who received the services that their data could be used to train an AI model? I'm going to bet the answer is no. So I think there's a lot under tension there in terms of informed consent, agency, accountability, localization. There are no straight answers here, and people need to really get into the real granular detail to work out what feels ethical and responsible for their agency.
And dare I say, we're going to try to do some of that difficult thinking and help people to do it. They're not on their own, right? We've got this group of brains and the people that are on this panel today thinking through some of this stuff because people are in the midst of this crisis. Staff are being cut, budgets are diminishing, and some of the people that might have been doing some of that strategic foresight thinking are no longer in a position to do it, right? So we just have to acknowledge the scale of the governance mess in the AI side of things as well as on the humanitarian side of things. This is going to be a moving, dynamic piece of work throughout the remainder of the year. We are going to come on to the technology partnerships bit, building a bit on what Julio said at the beginning. But Michael, I wonder if you could also give a quick introduction in your background and how you've come to this and what you saw in terms of the technology perspectives on partnerships with humanitarians in the past and how they might be changing in the current moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Is this on? Yes, hopefully. So yes, there's been really a lot of recent changes in the dynamics, and so just for context, I come from 25 years in the tech sector working on AI. Last year, I left the tech sector to focus on humanitarian AI consulting, and having worked within the tech sector many years closely with the humanitarian sector, it is interesting to see that. Hold on, let me see if oh, that was you. Can you hear?
Can everyone online hear Michael?
There's something happening. All right.
Okay, keep going.
So yeah, with the recent cutbacks to humanitarian aid from traditional donors, it has sort of opened the door for private sector foundations, philanthropic initiatives, and just tech sector in general to step up. And it's been good to see several companies and organizations having done that. Historically, the tech sector, the private sector has been preferred to not do like long-term commitments to individual organizations or individual humanitarian projects, more focused on something that's either shorter term or very clearly scoped as solutions, for example. There isn't necessarily anything bad about that. It just means that it's a little harder to make long-term strategic planning for related to funding. And I think we're going to see more of that from the tech sector going forward here as well, where it's grants to specific things, it's solutions that allows them to, when that completes, to take a step back and invest time and effort and money in another area. But I do think this dynamic that these changes from recent cuts to humanitarian aid it's really opened the door for the tech sector to play a more hands-on role in humanitarian aid, and so I think it's opened up the door for a new era of partnerships with the tech sector. The thing is, typically, humanitarian actors have been sort of behind the curve in terms of being able to evaluate and fully assess AI capabilities, AI models, AI services, as well as the vendors and the companies behind them. And so that's part of what we want to achieve with the Safe AI initiative. It provides a very clear guidance framework for how the humanitarian sector, should engage with technical partnerships, knowing which questions to ask, how to get started, and really build confidence in those interactions. And so we are this sort of very unique moment in time, right, where on one side, the humanitarian sector is underwater in terms of being able to address the humanitarian needs. And at the same time, the maturity of modern AI today has come to a state where it's very capable and can really play a central role in the path forward for the humanitarian sector. The risk then is, as organizations sort of grasping for straws to try to address all the needs, that the challenges they have with limited budget and resources, AI becomes very attractive. When you have to do more with less, AI can be a fantastic means for addressing those shortcomings. But if you jump in too fast, if you don't fully understand what it is you're engaging with, what the technology can do, there is the absolute risk of introducing unintended consequences. So again, as part of the Safe AI initiative, we want to make sure we provide the right guidance to humanitarian actors on how to take the first step, but also in the way that it meets you where you are in your AI journey.
And indeed, we've had quite a lot of appetite from various donors as well, who are interested in having some early insight into some of that steer. What conditionalities should they be bringing into their conversations with partners and operating agencies? So that'll be part of the audience now as well. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to go to Q&A in a minute, but there was one thing that I did want to go back to, because we talked about the crisis moment and the governance stuff, but we haven't quite engaged with the big politics that are going on, right? And the new role that technology companies, some of these very same providers, are playing in the big politics. And Julio, I know that Access Now have a particularly important role in sort of bridging with digital rights activists, and you had really interesting event last month in Taiwan, RightsCon. And I wonder if I could start with you on some of those big picture political trends that we need to be aware of from the technology perspective as well.
Thank you. And yes, indeed. And it was a cathartic moment for all of us to be able to meet and kind of come together. And there was this kind of feeling of not being alone, of being able to meet in person and be there, or online, because there were a lot of sessions, like just as many sessions online as there were in person, if I'm not mistaken. And there was this possibility of feeling that we are not alone, and that, you know, despite the attacks coming from basically all sides, there is this capacity to push back and to carve out a space where we can discuss frankly and openly about what does it mean to still want to do good and to still want to feel this kind of humanitarian spirit thriving despite all these kind of discussions being diverted to on the defense sector or on the tech sector, or everything being a little bit driven by kind of arguments that are more linked to the financing part, or to the capacity of what we can do, instead of thinking about the root causes of the problems or the big issues that are affecting people in real life. So this was the first takeaway. The first takeaway is that there is a lot of appetite, and I think it has just been said, the appetite of going beyond the tech itself, but rather to talk about what does it mean to actually face challenges and to potentially build something better. This was the first takeaway, this appetite to go beyond the labels, to go beyond the denominations. There was also a lot of cynicism and disillusion for the way that companies have been behaving lately, and also the governments, to be honest. There was this disillusion about the fact that nobody's standing up for the humanitarian cause. Very few governments have showed up in terms of what happens now. Like, what do we do? It has been evident in Gaza. It has been evident in Ukraine right now. It is evident that, you know, as soon as there are like the geopolitical incentives are taken away, there is this kind of, the rug is pulled under the feet of all the civil society actors, especially local actors, that are left alone to their own device. everybody's talking about AI, but then when push come to shove, these local organizations are left alone to foot the bill that they can't afford, or to just give up on any kind of tool that they've been generously granted by some kind of intermediary, be that an INGO or be that a UN agency. So this is the reality and what emerged from the discussions at RightsCon, that beyond all the nice talks about the power of AI, the reality is that if we don't change the paradigm, there will be a dependency, there will be a situation of an extractive behavior from tech companies graciously gifting something and then taking it away as long as it's not convenable or is not manageable to their agreement with power to be that in the US or somewhere else. So these were the main takeaways, that we need to discuss the geopolitical side of tech and stop considering that just because we like the people on the human rights team of a certain company that everybody's our friend and that we can trust on each other. Unfortunately, this is proving not to be the case. The good thing is that a few companies are still showing up, and there's still a few people within those companies, through whistleblowing or through active engagement or by doing their job, they're proving that there is hope. But what we are missing again is the good companies, the good government, the good parts of society showing up and saying, no, priority is not building more defense and more weapons. The priority is keep helping people. And this is what we are, what at RightsCon we all agree we are not seeing.
Well, that's a great rallying call, and thank you, Julio. I'm sure others will want to come in on some of these points, but I'm conscious that we also want to make space for questions and from the floor. So if people have questions they'd like to put into the chat, or people in the room to signal that you'd like to ask something, please do. But I'll go to the rest of the panel to maybe respond on the big politics point. Sarah?
Well, I was just going to say, I couldn't agree more, Julio. And I think to pick up on Anjali's point about AI being a socio-technical artifact, technology is not neutral, right? The idea that these technologies are free from sort of human bias and human influence and politics, there is plenty of scholarship out there and academic work that stretches back, really stretches back to early machine learning, to demonstrate that the values that we hold personally or even into a society get coded into the way that machines behave. But even more so now, tech companies, and more importantly, individuals, leaders, are acting as geopolitical actors. Their influence is geopolitical. And again, there's a huge amount of scholarship in academics and universities to demonstrate this. And I know, people are very live to what's happening in the White House, but there's plenty of other examples. I think there's a really interesting one for those who follow anything in the last, let's say 6 weeks, where everyone was concerned about data being on AWS servers. Like, the cloud is not neutral, right? And understanding who is the head of AWS, right? And what has changed with regards to the media landscape in the United States as well. And how Amazon has pitched for some very specific contracting work that didn't come through in the first Trump administration, but is now potentially coming through in this administration. These are corporations that are ultimately trying to, increase value for shareholders. That's the name of the game. But therefore, it's on humanitarians to think through, what does that mean for impartiality and neutrality, which, to Julio's point, is that's the license to trade for humanitarian organizations. And so I think for the Safe AI project is to really figure out how do we navigate those tensions? Like, those are sort of almost irreconcilable. How do we make sure that we can partner with organizations that demonstrate some kind of neutrality and impartiality, when the reality is they're also providing back-end support for the Pentagon, for national security and intelligence agencies, and actually sometimes having direct impact on how wars play out and taking explicit sides in Gaza, in Ukraine, and other conflicts. We need to really think about what that does to fundamentally what it does to humanitarianism itself.
Thank you. I think just to pick up on a couple of things here. One is recognizing that actually accountability is both an important priority, but also it's shifted, right? So our traditional mechanisms for redress, et cetera, just in the use of technology and the whole supply chain has shifted. And particularly for the humanitarian sector, I think this is going to be a critical point to really consider. So that, Julio sort of started off to talk about the cloud, and it's recognizing that when you procure a system, and almost everyone, Michael and Sarah, have all sort of said this too, is that it's not just this AI model, right? It is often built on another platform, cloud, whatever platforms. Those are often sometimes, AI again is also being embedded in many other technologies. And so it's recognizing that when you're procuring from whoever it is, they are often procuring from others as well. And that supply chain is actually sometimes quite opaque. So who do you go to, right? So even when you're going to service the lift, so to speak, it's now who's actually responsible, how far back along that supply chain do you need to go to in order to do that servicing, I think is one thing. And so then that becomes really critical again for the humanitarian sector, where the people that you're responsible to are really quite vulnerable, and the safety and security of their data and the decisions that are being made are extremely critical. So I think it's recognizing that whole humanitarian stack is not as simple and opaque. And then again, it goes to Michael said too, is like as part of SafeEye, is like we really want to look at like what are those critical questions that you need to be asking as you go to sort of procure a model, or even consider what models and tools that you might be using in whichever the context might be. I think this is also to recognize it's a critical time to engage with the affected communities. And while it seems like that's potentially even harder to do, or time consuming, it's a critical time to do so. And as Sarah said, in the sort of AI sort of academic space, there's been lots of sort of discussion around ethics washing and participatory washing as well. And so I think it's also about being really clear up front when you're engaging with the affected communities, is how much they are actually going to have to be able to play a critical role. Like if you're already deciding I'm implementing it, there's no reason to sort of say not, but where do they actually have agency, right? Like, are there particular aspects, and being really clear about that, because that's about building trust. Sorry.
And trust is in short supply at the moment, and we are very nervous about losing it even further in some of the critical operations. I might just double check if there's any questions from people in the room. I'm going to keep nudging you, but in the meantime, Alex, you might have thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in around kind of incentives and negotiating power when it comes to having these discussions with companies. I was reminded about a conversation I had with Michael as part of the AI Safety Label project, when we were talking about why would a company potentially pay for an assurance process that has a participatory element that brings communities into discussing the acceptability of risks. And I remember being really struck by you telling me there's no incentive there for the humanitarian sector isn't a big enough sector to actually, or a big enough market essentially for those companies. So you don't really have that negotiating power. I'm currently, as I said, we're working on doing something similar in the public sector in the UK, and I wonder, does the public sector in the UK have that negotiating power? Because certainly it seems to me that regulators and governments, they're not willing to really put teeth into some of the kind of requirements that they place on companies and the technology that they procure. And that's definitely one of the tensions around AI assurance, where regulators don't know how to apply standards because governments want to be hands-off. There's, again, kind of false binaries between, but we want to be permissive of innovation, but then also we need to have risk management. And I think there's, I don't know what the answers are, but I think there's probably an interesting point around who actually has the power of negotiation? I don't know, Michael, if you wanted to, because I've kind of brought you into my response, pick up on that.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I remember our conversation. I think to a large degree, as some of these new strategic partnerships with the tech sector, if they can be developed and sort of refreshed, if you will, it is more likely to be successful if you engage with the philanthropic side of the tech sector. As I mentioned in that discussion, yeah, the market for humanitarian aid from the tech sector's point of view is small relative to the broader commercial side. So you don't want to put too many obstacles in for the tech sector to be an active contributor.
Hi, Cara at the back. You're very welcome. Come on in.
Thank you so much for the really interesting discussion. I just want to offer a thought and a question to the panelists. I do feel those conversations are really helpful to, think through AI and in humanitarian context. I also feel that there is a lot of polarization around AI in humanitarian response. And obviously, as you rightly said, right now with the funding cuts, even more pressure to consider how we can use AI, that potential and so on. And so I feel that when we're talking about AI in general and the risks and so on, that also is conducive to that polarization, because you would have the people that said, yes, but that could really be cost effective. Yes. And the other side would say, yes, but what about, how it affects communities and power dynamics and risks and confidentiality and consent? And then the other side would say, yeah, but, it could really save in terms of effectiveness and so on. And so I do feel that going more into applications and use cases and talk practically speaking, what are we talking about in AI in humanitarian context? To what extent does that have the potential to actually make a difference? Because from where I stand, like from where I sit, if we were thinking about the problems that we were trying to solve, we would have already come together and invested heavily in language technology and how we can make sure that we can bridge that gap in communicating in minority languages that are not so minority languages, but the languages that are spoken in humanitarian context, because that's the biggest opportunity that I see in humanitarian response. And we haven't solved this and we haven't invested in this heavily. Instead of focusing on maybe like some potential applications that are not only risky, but also polarize people, And so I feel that if we were to, and so I come to my question in a second, but if we were to talk more in terms of specific scenarios, and side note promotion, we will have a session tomorrow on the application of AI in GBV programs. If you want to join, we'll be talking about scenarios, because I feel that this is where we can get to the bottom line of this. Is this something that we should collectively invest in or not? My question to you is on the Safe AI project. Can you talk more about how you're planning to contribute to that conversation in terms of specific application in contexts like Sudan? For example, we were talking about this yesterday. In contexts like Sudan, to what extent is that going to make a difference on what exactly, and how could we collectively contribute to this? Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. And there's an associated question in the chat as well. That's what are the risks from slow or low AI adoption by humanitarian organizations as well? So I'll ask the panel to reflect on that, the specific areas and grounded applied opportunities. And just to bridge the gap, yesterday evening, we had a representative from the Sudanese ERRs in the room listening to a similar talk presentation that we were doing. And what we did end up doing was committing as a Safe AI team that we would be testing our outputs with and through them, specifically to see if indeed this stuff might work for that kind of mutual aid environment, and which applications could be prioritized. So we'll come back to you on the Sudan thing, Carol, and you're right. It was there, everybody witnessed it, and we'll commit to trying to do more. I will open it up to perhaps Michael, you're nodding at me if you've got a reply on the risks and potential of slow and where applied cases are best examined.
Yes, actually, getting to Carol's questions, I've seen this sort of situation so many times where there's this sort of understanding within the sector that you need to do something with AI, but it's sort of hard to know how to take the first step. It's really daunting. There's so much happening within AI. It's moving fast and it's very broad. And so we want to make sure that people have it's important that they have sort of a appropriate level of understanding of what the technology does, how it works, how it makes mistakes, and both its potential and its limitations. That's one side. But making the connection to what's relevant to your day-to-day job within a humanitarian organization, how that can play a role, that's not obvious. And so making that connection is going to be really, really important. One of the ways you do that is by providing use cases from within the sector, case studies, examples of where AI has been used within the humanitarian context so that other actors can sort of more closely relate to that and see, yes, okay, I can see it's not exactly what I'm doing, but I can see how this is a way of using AI that I have not thought of in the context of my day-to-day work. So we're going to capture, obviously we won't be able to capture just like all use cases, but at least sort of finding the bigger categories and then help people understand sort of within that what is important to understand, both in terms of learning what the technology can do, but also what are the risks in terms of integrating AI into an ecosystem or an existing process. So helping people do that safely and responsibly.
Just to pick up on that, so we, as Michael said, we are looking at use cases and really grouping them or creating the typology of those risks. And it's also those limitations and recognizing, again, these capabilities are changing, right? So if you are just using ChatGPT and building on it, well, there's going to be an update, right? Any model is going to have an update at some point, most likely. And so then it's also, it goes to Sarah's point about, servicing, doing the MOT on your car or the Lyft from that aspect. I think I wanted to offer sort of two sort of examples from other dimensions. One is I've done a lot of work also at the intersection of the humanitarian sector and criminal justice, and as an advisor to the Canadian government, particularly around biometrics of DNA. And one of the things that actually I think shifted in terms of, in this case, it was like victims, was actually for us as an advisory group that was like, ministerially appointed, we actually shifted not just to have us as a scientific and technical policing, human rights and prosecutors at the table, but actually bringing in support, like the victim support group advocates that were now at the table. And so as we also work to change legislation as well at that level, was going, no, they're actually ministerially appointed to sit at that table. And so now actually really do have a voice at the table. And I think there's something to that about what the humanitarian sector can really do. But again, I think that goes back to the point of, yes, there's recognizing where there's going to be still power differentials and where they have that. One other thing that we've also seen as a result, actually, of what's happened recently in the US, and it was an example that we shared at RightsCon in our session, was what we've also seen is a shift of, say, one of my colleagues, or our colleagues, Nailing Morosi, shared how in Nigeria, where a AI company was using AWS, but actually found that the cost had skyrocketed and they could no longer afford to use AWS, and they created their own cloud computing. And I think this is also something we're seeing. One is around data sovereignty, AI sovereignty, but also people in a response, not only from the geopolitics, but from the economic standpoint. And so there's something for, I think, all of us is when you're engaging is actually there might be local actors and agencies to really work with on that. So
can I say something on that, actually, because I live in Nairobi and there's quite an active AI machine learning community there, and many of them are funded by institutional donors, government donors, with through venture capital funds, also direct investment and grants that have an explicit SDG focus or like AI for good focus, but they're unable to connect with their client base, potential client base, i.e. these huge, up until recently, well-funded international NGOs and UN agencies who are trialing AI and machine learning projects, usually drawing on technologies that were offered in the Pacific Northwest, California, and Europe. So there is this like disconnect between the locally built solutions and the locally owned problems. I did just want to say one really quick thing on that granularity question that Caroline mentioned, as well as the risks in slow and low adoption. On the latter one, the risks is that it just sort of depends on what your risk lens is. If you're thinking about what's the risk of NGO X in slow and low adoption, I would say that unfortunately, given past precedent and histories and track records, I'd say this is creating this absolute race to adopt, because the first one out the gate may have access or may have a competitive advantage for funding, right? So if you're thinking what's the risk there, I would say, well, the risk is really about the further deepening competitive nature between humanitarian agencies with probably no marginal impact or increasing effect or impact for communities, right? It's just like, as it ever was, increased competition. Now, in terms of the whole sector, if the whole sector collectively decided to be a bit slower in its adoption, I don't see a huge amount of risk there. I don't think there's going to be, Bill Gates is not going to get on the phone and be like, buy, right? I think this is an opportunity for us to say, actually, in collective behavior and in collective action, we could probably work to identify what those risks are and recenter our priorities and the adoption of AI on the communities and their risks to the communities. And then just on that granularity point that Anjali and Michael said, the solutions that I've seen aren't always like frontier AI, right? And I don't know why we continue to race to try and be like, let's get multi-agentic AI out into humanitarian action. And you're like, well, there's lots of really advanced machine learning, predictive analytics, stuff that's tried and tested that has way lower risks, has been tested throughout sort of like financial fintech industries around fraud identification, managing payments, managing accounting, supply chain management, warehousing, predictive maintenance, and even diagnostics. MSF has done some really excellent work on integrating computer imaging and computer vision into low resource medical clinics to improve diagnostics of antimicrobial resistance and cervical cancer. Like, that to me is like, why aren't we looking at these cases rather than just saying ChatGPT is gonna save us in this crisis? And I think this is, like, to the point, Caro, is like really ground down into those specific use cases and really test where those risks are and how we can surface some of those lessons learned to be more applicable across the sector.
Thanks. Yeah, I was just going to say, Julio's got his hand up and patiently waiting. Julio, please come on in.
I was just waiting for the safe AI team to answer the question on the safe AI, but that gave me a great segue out of it to go back to a comment that I really liked. It was about the language. I think this is one of the underestimated aspects of AI, and why I think personally, but also professionally, based on my research, that AI 90% of the time will not be the answer to any kind of field tool. For one simple reason. I do kind of push back against the idea that the sector has not invested on language-specific tools. Clear Global, Localization Lab, many have worked on it, still keep working on it. And by the way, I think Clear Global also is testing AI solutions. So this is happening. The problem very often, and I talk out of direct experience, is that whenever we tried language model based on any language that is not English, Levantine Arabic, for example, that is supposed to be one of the strongest, it is awful. It is horrible. The final outcome is always appalling, even if it comes from the most brilliant minds of the most advanced researchers studying linguistics and testing it on the ground. Then you test it with some users in Lebanon, and we did that just out of, for testing purposes, even before checking the software and everything. And people could not understand what the system was telling to them. It was just so bad. And this is from one of the major big tech companies a few years ago, and I don't think it got any better now. So I don't think the problem is very often that languages is complex. I'm not an expert in linguistics, but I think if you ask a few people, they will explain you that language is not just what's written on a book. It's much more than that. It's interaction. It's the level of also trust that people put into the system. It will shape the way that they communicate with the system itself. It will shape the way that the interaction will go. And this is runs much deeper. So I think the language it will be another stray kind of argument in trying to throw more money into a technical or technological solution that will not address the final issue, the final problem. So this was about the language thing. But again, I do think there are people trying to do a lot of work in equalizing the language barrier there. And also there is the fact that language also means more extractive behavior. So if we push for more people to be tested in their native language to improve large language models, we're also pushing for more extractive behavior on minority languages, or to be extracted from them without necessarily their consent. So there is a dark side to the language-oriented AI. And to conclude, there is the answer on the online. I think the risk is not from slow or low AI adoption, but it's from slow or low AI engagement. The sector needs to engage headfirst into the way that technology is developed, not necessarily into the adoption phase.
I think there are also really exemplary kind of case studies of participatory development of local language data sets who then go on to think about the kind of governance processes around those data sets and who and why should have access to them. So I agree that seems to be such a great opportunity if it's done correctly, and there's a lot of potential for good participatory engagement and actually listening to people what they want from those tools and how they want those data sets to be used. And Clear Global was mentioned. I think the Common Voice kind of initiative by Mozilla McElhinney. I know there's a group in New Zealand developing tools around Maori language. So I think we do have these examples to kind of draw on so that potentially we can invest in that opportunity.
Is there maybe something interesting there around how you extract different types of value, how those trade-offs are surfaced? And I think, wasn't the Maori language one where they were negotiating different terms of trade when they were sort of building these things? There's probably someone, I see Anjali nodding on the panel. Maybe Anjali, I can throw to you on that one.
So Caleb Moses was part of our group at RightsCon from the Maori side, developing these language models, working with elders, and in particular in New Zealand, where they actually already have negotiated data sovereignty. And so I think that's part of it. So again, this is where the communities have negotiated with the state. And then again, Caleb, who's been leading this work and is based at Mila in Canada, as well as, of course, in New Zealand, working with the elders, which is his community, is really looking at how does he best involve the elders in this and the values of the Maori community. But again, they've been able to negotiate with New Zealand and build on that data sovereignty side. So I think that's part of the building locally in those.
Well, I was going to say, there's a point that to your point about building local solutions, there's also a firm, and I wish I could remember their name, in West Africa that was building a computer vision model, an app, to help farmers identify fungal infections on cassava plants and other defects or things on crops at local level, smallholder farmers. And for participating, they had to pay a subscription fee to use the app, But the more they fed their images in, the more it wasn't straight equity that they got in the firm, but they were remunerated for helping, and they owned a share of the company essentially for helping to train the model. So it wasn't extractive by nature. It was really a community solution addressing a community problem, to Michael's point, where it's like, what's the commercial impact of like small farmer cassava? Probably not a huge amount of value to be generated for shareholders, but for those communities, a huge amount of value. And building solutions where the community are all involved in that. So that's like at the very community level rather than sovereign state level, right? Doing both at the same time, you can build equitable tools for sure.
I like this, and I see lots of people nodding and taking notes of the good examples of where things are going really well, because we can get into the concerns quite quickly. But the key thing is that there's lots and lots of trade-offs that we're talking about here. Tech AI capabilities being both a tool, but also a thing that is affecting who has power, and more importantly, who doesn't have power and voice in the future of humanitarianism. So we've got to keep approaching it from both these angles. I'm going to give us the privilege of final remarks. We think we've answered questions online, we've answered questions in the room, and there is, I believe, a drinks reception that we are on our way to next. So in the interest of getting us all there when the sun is still shining, I'm just going to let the panel run from maybe Michael backwards, actually, on concluding remarks, and then we will wrap and get into the sunshine.
Yeah, I think I'll just say as a recommendation for any humanitarian act organization who is considering leveraging AI in a more meaningful, purposeful manner as part of how they do operation or tasks, is to take the first step. It really just get started very small, build familiarity with the technology, with the tool, build trust, and then start with a very small pilot, a proof of concept that you can sort of share with the team, with the group, and then get feedback and build trust within your organization as well before starting to think about some bigger implementation. Start small, but get started.
I think building on that, I think it's asking questions, right? Asking critical questions. And I think it's also recognizing where you are in the humanitarian sector and asking, what can I do and who else can I work with and engage with to be better informed as you look, whether it's to implement it, to support affected communities, whatever that role is that you're playing.
I love that. I mean, I'm constantly amazed at how much work has gone on in the AI world that has nothing to do with humanitarian work that we're not drawing on, really. So I second that point. We touched on it, but accountability is, I mean, wasn't in a great state. Accountability to affected populations. I've seen use cases that involve chatbots where those building it, who are humanitarian agencies, have explicitly said they are not accountable for anything bad that happens with this solution, and nor, frankly, are the tech firms, because they've layered on APIs and fine-tuned the models. I find that absolutely appalling, frankly, that we're putting out solutions to engage directly with affected communities and really just washing our hands of anything that could go wrong with those solutions. And this particular one that I'm thinking of had no guardrails for children. There was nothing related to anyone under the age of 13 or 15, and had a very trusted humanitarian brand on it. So I really think that is not being centered enough in the design of our solutions, and how we own when these algorithms fail, because they do. They're not perfect solutions. So we really need to think more critically about that.
I've been really kind of inspired and bolstered by the return to localizing technology during this conversation and participatory development or oversight of technology. I think there's so much potential there for, I guess, improving the way that we approach AI adoption, and all the way through a AI development pipeline, from the start to the middle to the finish. If you're even procuring tools, there's still a lot you can do with involving communities in decision making or oversight. And I think there's a lot more we can do in kind of sharing lessons from engaging with communities, and also picking up on a point that I think Julia made earlier, I guess maybe committing to transparency and learning from each other, because I think there's a lot of fear of, oh, but we didn't get it quite right, so we're not going to talk about it at all. And I just think there's a lot to be gained from being much more open. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Julia, can I come to you for the last word?
That's a lot of responsibility. And also, I expect an online drink for the reception later. The final remark for me is that very simply, we need to fight against this tendency of the humanitarian sector to exclude the human rights framework that has been an established reality for over a decade through the business and human rights framework from anything that has to do with our own sector. And this is like, unacceptable. So we reinvent the wheel every single time. Back to basics, the business and human rights framework, due diligence, downstream, upstream, responsibility and accountability has been solved for rockets, for airplanes, for engines, for anything that has a level of complexity that honestly AI is way, we're not talking about that yet. And we managed to find responsibility layers and accountability systems and mechanisms for those technologies and make them safe for use for everyone. Why shouldn't we do the same for the humanitarian field? Well, because we don't want to. So it's maybe time to fight back and demand that human rights accountability frameworks and protection frameworks are put first, and then technology comes next.
I think that's a great place to end, and you'll be pleased. I've just dropped it in the chat for everybody to have a look at that human rights due diligence framework, which is indeed already alive and kicking. Guys, thank you so much for joining us for this session. And thank you very much to the panelists for being here with us online and in person. Can I have a big round of applause before we leave? Thank you all. We'll be in touch, right? Onwards to the bar.